My name's Tim Barringer and I teach British art at Yale University, and I'm also the curator of the exhibition Opulence and Anxiety, which is an examination of British landscape painting from the 1780s up until the present day. One of the themes that's fascinated me as I've worked on this exhibition is the relationship between the interests of artists, painters in this period, and other figures in the intellectual and cultural world, particularly musicians. And it seems to me that landscape is a shared interest, particularly of British and English, specifically English, artists and musicians, especially in the Victorian era. We might wonder why landscape becomes such a preoccupation for painters, actually also for writers and for musicians in this period. And I think the answer lies in the development of industrialization and the fact that increasingly, and after 1851, a majority of the population lived in cities rather than in the country. And suddenly the landscape was something alien rather than something everyday. It was a place of leisure, a place of escape from the pressures of the town. So what we find is that landscape painters are going on sketching expeditions and gaining inspiration all over, not just all over Britain and its empire, but in fact all over the world. And some of those paintings are included in the exhibition. But also that musicians, from the beginning of the 19th century, are increasingly inspired by what they see in nature, rather than, say, by the traditional religious subjects which had inspired some musicians, or simply by writing abstract music in the form of symphonies and concerti. And I think the most interesting figure to look at in this regard is Sir Edward Elgar, born in 1857 in Broadheath near Worcester. Elgar always thought of himself as a countryman, although, of course, nearly all of his music was actually performed in towns and in cities, in the great concert halls of London, Birmingham, Manchester, and Leeds. So Elgar's life was constantly split between the countryside that supplied his, as it were, the imaginative roots of his composition, the inspiration, and the towns and cities where the music was performed by the great urban symphony orchestras and choruses. And I think one thing that has been neglected by those who've written about Elgar in the past is just how visual he was, just how his imagination was stimulated by what he saw. And in turn, what I'd like to suggest is that what he saw was suggested by works of art, but actually that what he looked for in nature, what he looked for as he was walking in the country, the famous images of Elgar in his boots and jacket, stalking through the Malvern Hills and walking through the countryside in Worcestershire. But what taught him to appreciate those views, what made him aesthetically sensitive to the landscape, was in fact looking at paintings like those in this exhibition. Elgar was a very keen exhibition goer. He went to the Royal Academy, and he was a great admirer of works by his friend Benjamin Williams Leader, also from the same town of Worcester as Elgar, and also by artists like George Vickert Cole, whose Autumn Morning of 1891 gives a wonderful feeling for the sort of the Victorian idyll of landscape, the Victorian idea of a perfect landscape. It's not sublime and dramatic. It's not the Alps or the Rocky Mountains. It's a simple scene of an untroubled English countryside. This actually is a scene in Surrey, just outside London. And it was in this kind of world that Elgar was able to walk around, and that he was able to form his ideas of the landscape and to write his music. So I think we have a sort of idyllic vision of a landscape completely untroubled by industrialization. There are no trains, no tourists, no traffic lights in this landscape. It's a completely uncorrupted world. The great works of Elgar's career derive from the period of the reign of King Edward VII, which ran from 1901 to 1910. And of course we use the word Edwardian to refer to the last days of the greatness of the British Empire, pomp and circumstance, the very music that Elgar provided for the coronation of King Edward himself. But there's a much more intimate, introspective side of Elgar, usually connected with works inspired by the English landscape, or in one case by the Welsh landscape. The introduction, An Allegro for Strings, which was premiered in 1905, was originally inspired by music that Elgar heard wafting up from the Welsh valleys as he was walking in the hills. And it's that more introspective side, that more landscape-based side of Elgar's music, which I think finds a close comparison in the landscape paintings that were exhibited at the Royal Academy in that same period. This was a great era for English landscape painting in the hands of artists like George Clausen and particularly Sir Alfred East, someone who Elgar actually met at functions of the Royal Academy. By that time, they were two grand old men of the English establishment. And Alfred East's landscapes started off like Elgar's, very opulent, very grand, very flamboyant. But towards the end of East's life, and he died in 1914, just after this painting of the Cotswolds was completed, the later works have a much more elegiac tone. They tend to be emptied of narrative content, and they tend to be more introspective, more wistful. They sense a shadow falling over the English landscape. British culture was going to be changed irrevocably by the First World War, which ran from 1914 to 1918. It certainly changed the lives of every artist and every musician operating in Britain, or indeed anywhere in Europe or the British Empire. Charles Sims, a painter who'd been trained at the Royal Academy schools and who had achieved some success with mythological and historical works, turned to the landscape in 1913, capturing the innocence which I think he realized was soon to be lost as the clouds of war, inevitable war, built up over Europe. In his painting Cleo and the Children, he creates an absolutely idyllic image of the Sussex Downs with the English Channel in the distance and an absolutely clear blue sky. A group of children are listening to Cleo, the muse of history, speaking to them, telling them of the great acts of the past. And Sims completed the painting in 1913. It's a kind of testimony of faith in youth and innocence. But 2 years later, his son was killed in the First World War, and Sims returned to the painting, and particularly to the figure of Cleo, the muse of history. He took red paint and blotted out the roll from which she was reading, the scroll of history, and blotted it out with the blood of the First World War. Nothing would be the same again. Edward Elgar, who had fallen virtually silent after composing Falstaff, a symphonic poem, in 1913, began to compose again in 1918 in the very same area that Sims had painted his idyllic landscape, in Sussex. Elgar rented a small cottage which had actually been used by an artist. It was an artist's studio attached to it, and that's where Elgar's piano was placed. And in this post-war world, this kind of landscape of annihilation, Elgar moved down to Sussex. In fact, he started composing just before the end of the First World War, and as he started to put notes on the paper, he could still hear from across the Channel the distant sound of gunfire and artillery. The music that he composed in this new and different and unkind world was purer, smaller, more straightforward, more simple than the opulent scores of the Edwardian era. He composed chamber music, particularly a piano quintet inspired by some strange, eerie trees that he observed in the Sussex landscape, and also the string quartet, which is perhaps the most formally perfect of his works. On a smaller scale, just written for 4 instruments, it seems to capture both a nostalgia for a lost rural utopia and a realistic sense of the landscape after the First World War.